This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Joel, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a human being who is on this journey of life, just like everybody else. I listened to an interview that Oprah Winfrey did with a person by the name of Deepak Chopra. And she asked this question of him, and he probably has the best response that I've ever heard. He said, "I am a spark of the divine, and so is everybody else," and I believe that. And that each of us is so much more than maybe our identities, or the boxes we get put into, or the labels that get put on us, So yeah, so that's who I am.
Who are you?
I am a son. I am a brother to 9 people. I come from a family of 10 children. We all start with J, including my mom and dad, who are Jim and Judy. I am an uncle to a wonderful group of nieces and nephews. I'm a friend, a neighbor, a community member, a partner, a significant other. So yeah, those are some of the probably most, a set of the most important titles that I hold in my life.
Who are you?
I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. I love to read. So I'm a person that spends a decent amount of time reading, going to the library, getting books, especially during COVID times. One of the good things that came out of COVID for me is that I did read it more. And I'm always trying to learn, I suppose, and improve myself. I probably equally as important to learning, I consider myself to be someone who's constantly unlearning things that I once believed to be true, at some point in my life.
Who are you?
I am an introvert. I like to call myself an extroverted introvert. I love being with people. I am a social person, but I don't, my definition of introvert doesn't mean not being social, but I am someone that, loves downtime. And the way that I recharge my batteries is usually by having downtime. So I love being with people, but I equally love being at home by myself, so I like both parts.
Who are you?
One of my identities is that I am a person who is gay. And I have other identities, of course. I have brown hair and I'm right-handed and I have green eyes and, all that stuff. So I don't necessarily feel that being gay is any more or less than my other identities, but it is the one identity that has taken up the most space in my life, and probably for a long period of time caused me the most turmoil and anguish. It doesn't anymore, but it did for a long time. And it's also the part of my identity that probably has shaped me as a human being the most, in the regard that it's given me the ability to empathize and have compassion for other people. Yeah.
Who are you?
I am someone who believes that peace is possible. I believe that peace in our world is possible. Right now we have, of course, things like war going on in our world, and I'm going to keep aspiring and believing that we can have peace on this earth, and that to do so, it's going to require peace within our countries, peace within our communities, peace within our homes. And first and foremost, for me, I believe that peace begins with me. So at this stage in my life, I am always working on my own peace of mind within myself and within my, little bubble, the world, my little bubble of the world. Yeah.
Finally, for now, who are you?
Restorative justice and circle has taught me to see people for their values, and so if you've ever been in circle and you've ever had to write down your value words on an index card or a paper plate, some of the value words that I have written down over the years are things like humble is something I aspire to, kindness, seeing the good in other people, peace, constant learning. And usually when I talk about my values in circle, I usually will mention that I learned most of my values from my mother. And my mom had and still has a really great way of not necessarily telling us her values, but just living her values. And as a kid and as an adult, I think the way I learned best was being able to see someone who modeled those values for us.
Thank you so much, Joel, for sharing all those intersections of who you are. We will be back with our full conversation right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Joel Friesz to this Restorative Justice Life. Joel was introduced to the field of restorative justice in around 2005 and felt an immediate connection. He held his first circle in 2008 and has continued as an avid student and advocate for the process ever since. He is also involved with the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. Let's get back to Joel now.
Again, thank you so much, Joel, for being here. Very excited to be having this conversation with you. You've been doing restorative justice work for a long time. And, in your new role, there are lots of exciting things on the horizon. But before we get into all of that, I am, just happy to be having this conversation. And it's always good to check in at the beginning. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question in this moment, how are you?
Yes. No, thank you for asking me. I am doing good. Overall, I am doing great. I am so thankful and grateful for so many things in my life. It's April, of course, and I live in Fargo, North Dakota, and it has seemed like a long winter, and we are finally moving into springtime, and my tulips out in my yard are finally peeking through the ground. So I'm excited for that. From being in circle over the years, I've got to hear some really good check-ins, questions. And I remember one person a few years ago said something to the effect, life is all about constantly balancing joys and sorrows, So some of my joys are, I am healthy, I live in a safe home, so those things balance out some of the sorrows. And probably the absolute best check-in I ever heard in Circle, and I, of course, won't give any details because what is shared in Circle stays in Circle, of course. But to this question, someone said, I am doing good in all of the ways that I can talk about, but I'm not doing good in the ways I can't talk about or in the ways I haven't yet had time to process. And I love the way that was phrased, and it's always stuck with me because I can be doing good and not good probably at the same time sometimes. So how about you? How are you doing?
You put a time into, where we are. So people know that I am the parent of a newborn. And so that is the largest thing that has an impact on my current state of being, which if I'm going for emotions, one, there is like excitement and gratitude for being in the space, presence, but also just like this constant underlying like of sleep deprivation, exhaustion, and tiredness. But the caffeine seems to be kicking in, and I'm ready to go, ready to tackle this, which I know this conversation, which I know is going to be very wide ranging. So I want to get right into it. You've been doing restorative justice work according to the bio that was given out by NACRJ since 2005, right? But you probably had undercurrents of this work going on for you before then. So in your own words, how did this work get started for you?
Yes. I like the way you asked this question. But as you mentioned about my bio, that part of this does start in 2005. So I'll maybe start there, but there are pieces of this that go back, I think, to my childhood. But in 2005, I saw a job posting it was a part-time job for a restorative justice facilitator. I knew basically nothing about what restorative justice meant. I had graduated from college about 5 years prior, and I was in sociology and criminal justice. And probably in all 4 years of college, we probably had one chapter in one book in my entire, years at college that talked about restorative justice. But I saw the job posting, I applied for it. And from the interview, I knew that this made sense to me. I liked this. It was for a part-time facilitator to work with cases that were in the juvenile justice system. And I remember thinking I was not going to make a good facilitator after I did the interview, because I was picturing in my mind at that time that a facilitator had to be like a bar bouncer, someone that roughed people up and kept them in line during a conversation. I, of course, learned quickly on that that's not what being a facilitator is, and it's actually the opposite. So some of my characteristics of being soft-spoken, mellow, are some of the skills that I eventually tapped into as a facilitator. I did that role for about 3 years, and then a position opened up for a statewide restorative justice director in that same program I was working with. So I moved into that role in 2008, and then got to support, the restorative justice program that was throughout the state of North Dakota. It was at that same time, 2008, that I attended my first circle. It was in Wisconsin. It was a 2-day circle session, and there was like 60 people there. And I can still picture this, being in this room, and the talking piece went around this circle, and it came back to the circle keeper. And it seemed to take forever to get through, this circle. And then it comes back to the circle keeper, and they say, we're now going to pass it around a second time. And I was like, what? We're going to do this again? And of course, at that point in my life, my capacity to be in circle or to hold space and attention for people was probably pretty minimal. But at that time, it seemed like a big feat to get, around a circle of 60 people. That next year in 2009, Kate Pranis came to North Dakota, the University of North Dakota, and did a 2-day circle session. And then in that circle, it was a smaller group of people, maybe 20 people or so. And we were able to practice the elements of circle so much more. And that experience just sealed the deal for me, and I just knew that I wanted to be a part of this. And so, the rest is history in that way. But David, you asked about, maybe this was a part of me before I even knew the words restorative justice. So going back a little bit further, I at some point I stumbled across a journal I kept from about in 1999 or 2000 when I was in college. And in one of my journal entries, I described myself as a facilitator. And I was shocked when I read that because I would have had no understanding of what a facilitator meant in a professional capacity. But I think I was referencing it in terms of a family situation or a friend situation. But I must have seen something in me that resembled, or I felt the qualities of a facilitator. And then maybe the last thing I'll say, when I was, a child of, is if the world is a circle, a proverbial circle, the identity of mine of being a person who is gay did not fit into that circle. In a lot of ways, I probably internally felt banished and outside of the circle, the proverbial circle, because I didn't think it was okay. I didn't think that identity was okay. And I want to, say that it wasn't my family that made me feel that way. It's just what the world taught me at that time. It was in every single message I absorbed as a child. And I so badly wanted, to fit in and be a part of the circle, so I contorted myself in every way possible to fit in so that people would like me and accept me. So I didn't acknowledge that part of my identity or accept it until I was 30 years old. And that was a really painful process for me. It wasn't painful after I came out, but it was painful prior to. And so I think that's why I resonate with circle, is because I view circle as a space where we're working to honor all people and all identities and all voices. And yeah, I think that's why I love being in circle so much, because it's working towards that.
Yeah. Many things were striking in what you shared, but I think one of the things that stands out the most is you were doing restorative justice work for years before having experienced circle. I'm curious what resonated with you when you first understood, like, oh, this is what restorative justice is, versus, oh, wow, this circle thing, this is what's up.
Mm-hmm. My entry point for restorative justice was the restorative justice conferencing for cases that were in the justice system. Mm-hmm. So that did shape my first perspective of it. And I viewed restorative justice as being a process for parties who are impacted by crime. You have a person who is the person who caused the harm, and then you have the person who has been harmed. And it was this process, an opportunity to bring these parties together if they wanted to come together. So for me, it was this other way of doing things opposed to what the criminal justice system had to offer. And I immediately loved it. I as a facilitator, being in those situations and walking that path with people, I saw how transformative it was. And I think I just gravitated towards that. And I also love that restorative justice is not about labeling people. It's not putting someone in the box of a victim or in the box of an offender, but it's viewing things as who has been harmed and how do people want, how do they want to move forward? It's not about this system saying this is how you have to move forward, but it's about asking them. So that was my first experiences. And then circle and restorative practices. And when I say restorative practices, most of my, experience is with K-12 education, working with schools who are implementing restorative practices. But then it just became so much more, because then it's about this proactive piece of building relationships. And I also gravitated towards that piece too, so.
Yeah. And I think it's worth doing now. Sometimes we wait for the end. In your own words, define restorative justice as you understand it now.
I thought you might ask me this. And for a long time, I felt like I had to have a definition for this as being someone who's been involved in this field for a while. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people I don't have a good elevator speech, to describe restorative justice. But for me, I go back to some of the basics of the questions of it's asking who has been harmed by a situation, how what are their needs, how do they want to move forward, so I still view it in that way often. But it's also about building community and relationships and those proactive pieces. And I guess one thing that comes to mind at the moment, when I read Colorizing Restorative Justice when it came out, probably my absolute favorite sentence in that book is by the chapter, the author, who is Sharon Goins Bradley, I believe is their name. And they write this piece where it says to uphold the value of every person. And that is the sentence that I have been clinging to, that this is about upholding the value of every person. And even if someone has caused harm, that we can still uphold their value as they work to repair that. And if someone has been a victim of a crime, that we can work to uphold their value, So that's one sentence that has resonated with me in recent years.
Yeah, no, thank you. That makes so much sense. And, lots of different ways that people explain this work. There is no one right way. We don't believe in definitions like hard and concrete like that here in this space, especially in this work where, in any circumstance, upholding somebody's value means talking to them in the way that they understand, right? In a way that makes sense to them. So thank you for that framing. I'm curious, as you've done this work through K-12 education, through the time that you were involved in the criminal legal system, what are a couple of instances that stand out to you where it's oh yeah, this work is one, really what I'm supposed to be doing, but two, oh, this is really impactful?
Maybe I'll start with K-12 schools. So the first school that I worked with was with one of our school districts here in North Dakota, and it was in 2009. And at that time, when I first started getting involved, Minnesota Department of Education was a huge mentor of mine, because they were doing such good work in this field, and just in proximity geographically, I'm next door to Minnesota. So I am so thankful to be so close to them. And, at that time, I remember going into schools and, nobody knew much at that time, I would say, about restorative practices, what it meant. They didn't have the experience of being in circle, all of those things. And I recently, just in the past few weeks, got to be with that same school district again. So now this is 12 years later. And I've done a lot of things with them in the past 12 years. But as I was with them a week or two ago and seeing the change in how restorative practices are being implemented in all of those proactive ways, like in a school, we call them, I suppose, tier 1 supports. Instead of this just being something that happens at tier 3, when something hurtful or harmful happens, I left that day feeling so good about just how far this has come and how we're working towards the relationship building of human beings, and in that capacity with students in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it didn't take 12 years for them to get there, but like, it is this idea that this work doesn't happen overnight. These ideas don't like fully manifest into the way that a school culture is, just like that, right? It takes time. And, even 12 years later, people are still working things out, and without getting into the specifics of this district, but we have a long history of the industrial model of schooling, the banking model of schooling, where we're trying to produce test scores, produce workers, right? Not necessarily value the humans. And this work asks us to uphold the value of all humans beyond their quote unquote academic achievements, or the way that these structures often ask us to do, and see people for a little bit more of who they are. Not that academic achievement isn't important, not that attendance isn't important, not that being able to, quote unquote, master subjects is important, but, how are we teaching people to uphold the values of other humans in the world in the process? Beautiful. You talked about that experience doing this work in schools. What did that look like for you in the criminal legal system?
Yeah. So in the legal system, and I would say for most of my experience, it's been in the juvenile system. The state of North Dakota, in our juvenile justice system, we have, in my opinion, I think we have a real progressive way of doing juvenile justice, going back to probably the 1980s, 1990s, where it was really about accountability, and...
Can you define accountability?
Yeah, accountability. No, thank you for asking, because that kid means so much. So my first reason for probably saying it was to make the distinction between accountability and just punishment for the sake of punishment, but accountability to the person or community that has been harmed by a situation. So North Dakota had this approach to juvenile justice where the juvenile justice system would engage service providers in the community even before restorative justice started in North Dakota, in other ways, but to provide opportunities for youth to have an opportunity to be, accountable to the people they've harmed. Is that how would you define accountability?
Yeah, accountability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In many ways, the framing of like quote unquote holding people accountable doesn't ring true for me, because like you can only be accountable to yourself and the people who you choose to be in community with, right? And so much of what we call accountability is like building relationships and providing support and inviting people in. I think it was Dorothy Vandering who shared this framework with me of like supporting people in being their most human self and challenging them to be their most human self, right? With consent, because anything else is just punishment or doing things for people, if we're talking about like the social discipline window, if you will. And so it is that idea of within yourself and within community that you're parts of, that both support and challenge. to be your most human. Again, I love that framing of upholding the value of all humans. We're going to continue coming back to that. So thank you, Sharon, for giving us that framing. But you were talking about accountability being centered in the framing of the North Dakota juvenile justice system, engaging with community partners before I interrupted you. So continue.
No, David, I love the way you frame the accountability piece. So going back to the North Dakota juvenile justice system. So at the agency that I worked for about 17 years or so, we had a statewide program where we had staff located across the state of North Dakota who did the restorative conferencing process for youth and families. And I think from just being a part of so many of those processes over the years, because I think your question was, what pieces of it made me realize I wanted to be a part of this. And, I feel, I don't think privileged is the right word that I'm looking for, but I am grateful for having the opportunity to have been a part of so many of those processes. And, I've learned in my role as a facilitator over the years that it's not about me as a facilitator. One of the things that Mark Umbright from Minnesota, I remember, has said over the years is being a facilitator is about creating this space and then getting the heck out of the way, that you're just clearing a path. So I try to take up as least space as a facilitator in the process as possible. But just, I can think of some situations over the years where just some really, harmful things had been done in a community. In North Dakota, we're made up of a lot of small communities. We don't have a lot of large urban areas. So, and this is probably true for other places too, but, when a crime, say, for example, happens in a really small community, it can really, hurt, just like it can hurt anywhere. And it can leave a wound for a really long time, maybe generations, And I think by being a part of some of the restorative conferencing processes over the years, you can see that wound being healed and that the impacts of the harm are not going to carry on year after year, generation after generation, that it was a process that brought some form of healing to it.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, and I've had, we've worked in North Dakota since about 2010 with the adult Department of Corrections, so that's more for, maybe someone who's currently incarcerated, or maybe someone who's in the community, but it's on parole or probation, for example. And in North Dakota, if a victim of a crime wants to meet with that other party, then we have processes in place to make that happen. So I've been able to be a part of those processes, and I just have a really strong stance that I believe that process and that opportunity should be available to all people who have experienced a victimization. Of course, not every person who's experienced being a victim is going to want that process, but I am a strong advocate that process should be an option for people.
Yeah, my start in this work was tangential to the criminal legal system, and for many reasons, I've moved away from doing this work within that realm. I totally agree that like those things should be available to folks. The ability to, both as a person who causes harm or quote unquote breaks a law, right? We don't need to go into like rule breaking versus like causing harm, but those processes should be available to people both who cause harm and who have been harmed. And like so much harm happens outside of the state, outside of like what the state defines as harm. And when you give so much power to the state, the criminal legal system, the police, right? There is potential for this work to be not just like watered down, but used harmfully. And I know over your experience doing that, you've seen that happen. What are the ways that you've seen people prevent that or stay true to this process and true to these values?
One way that I've worded this for schools is the more that we can listen to the person harmed, the less we're going to have to rely on a system to impose in the situation, and that's one of maybe the talking points I've had when we talk about like the school to prison pipeline, that, youth are sometimes being, enabled or funneled into this system, and it's not often necessary for what I think people would want, that if we use a different process or listen in a different way, we don't have to rely on that system. But it's, to your point, and with my experience, it is about a restorative justice component working with state systems, sometimes state systems or even school systems, working with the discipline practices of a school system. And there is a balance in making that happen. And I can see how things can, like I think you said, get distorted or worded or watered down. But it's something I try to be aware of, and I try to work against it as much as possible.
Yeah, I think, thinking with that in mind, I want to, transition to thinking about like your current role, your new role, where as the new executive director of the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice, you are holding space for all the ways that people interpret restorative justice. How have you conceptualized doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I onboarded in my new role in just a few months ago. I did previously serve on the board of directors at NACRJ since 2017. So having that experience with the organization does help me now that I'm a employee of, the organization. David, to your point of what you're asking, I do feel a responsibility. I feel the weight of the moment in time that we're at, where restorative justice has grown so much in so many ways in my short years of being involved in it. And there is so much momentum, but it is defined and comes to life in so many different ways, depending where you're at. I feel a responsibility with that, with honoring the work that everyone is doing. Where NACRJ is a member organization where we have, over 500 members who do a diverse set of things across the country. And they're all beautiful and good, but they're broad and in an array of different things. And I also feel, a responsibility to always staying true to the origins of restorative justice, probably before those words were even used. I'm lucky to live, in a state with 5 tribal nations. I have learned a lot over the years from going to workshops and being with scholars in restorative justice, but I have learned equally as much from being at Standing Rock or Fort Berthold and other tribal nations within North Dakota, where maybe an elder talks about their view of justice, so I try to listen as much to that wisdom as I do to any of the other formal trainings, that I have. I attended my first conference for NACRJ in 2013. It was in Toledo, Ohio. I just connected with it right away. I loved the idea of coming together with other people from across the country who have this shared vision and this common purpose. I'm out in North Dakota. We have a pretty robust restorative justice, process throughout the state, but most people would never even know that. They would not even know that restorative justice is happening in North Dakota. And I think that's true for so many other areas across the country. And I really connected with this organization that was helping people come together. That's what I felt at that time when I came to that conference in Toledo. I then went back and, Fort Lauderdale was in 2015. Oakland was in 2017, Denver in 2019. And of course, we're planning for the Chicago conference now to be held in Chicago in this summer.
July 7 through 9 with a pre-conference date of July 6. Link to sign up in the show notes. Continue.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning it and for all of the support and promotion that you do on this. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, have loved listening to these podcasts and all of the wisdom I've heard from others on this podcast and for the support that you show to NACRJ. And David, when I came into this role, I spent a lot of time discerning if this was the right thing for me. I never set out in life to be an executive director. I was worried, and I still worry about this sometimes, that being in this kind of position is going to take me away from what I consider like the work of restorative justice, or, doing things like being a facilitator or being in circle. And I was concerned that being in this kind of position would limit that. And that's what I get the most, connects with me the most, is the direct work of things. But I spent a lot of time discerning about it. And my motivation for being in this role was I want to serve this field. I want to serve people and organizations across this country who are working on this the same way that I was working on this at our nonprofit in North Dakota when we were, we're members, our organization here is a member of NACRJ as well, so yeah, those are some of the things that come to mind, I guess, for me as I enter into this new phase.
Yeah, I'm curious. So I first encountered NACRJ when I learned of the conference in 2017 that was in Oakland. Mike Gilbert, shout out to Mike, who is the outgoing executive director, was kind enough to let me come in and volunteer when I didn't have money as a grad student to pay my way. But I was also mind blown by the diversity in opinion and practice in what people were calling restorative justice. My orientation towards this work coming up in Chicago was very different than some of the ways that it's been practiced in lots of different spaces. And, speaking to those tensions, where do you, in your role, and maybe you don't even see it as your role, but I'm projecting this onto you. How do you, in your role, serving this restorative justice movement, want to continue to hold that space for people who are practicing differently, acknowledging that some of the way that people are practicing is a little bit divorced from the origins that you were talking about, the indigenous origins that you were talking about, in more ways than others for some?
I think this point that you're saying is a talking point within the field. Mm-hmm. It's been a talking point, and I think it's there's probably even been momentum around this specific talking piece as this field grows and evolves. How do you ensure, and who gets to decide mm-hmm. what some of the original intents were of it. I mean, those are some of the things I grapple with. And I think, some of the groups that I've been a part of, even before coming into this role, to talk about things like best practices, what are best practices? And I like the words that you used about the holding space, because for me, I plan to do a lot of listening in this role and to try to first kind of absorb what is all being done in different ways and what are the commonalities, and is there anything that can be done to create, the words that come into mind for me right now is just best practices. But again, it's kind of going back to that question of like, well, who gets to decide the best practices? All of those things. But I think one of the beauties of restorative justice is that it's so broad. And I don't think philosophy is maybe the right word to use, but I will say I sometimes use the words philosophy. It's almost like a philosophy, a worldview of looking at things. So I think that's the beauty in it. I think it's also one of the challenges, because as this thing moves forward, if there is not some definition or some parameters, then going back to kind of your earlier point, or the words you used, watered down or divorced from what it originally was, can happen. And I think it's a risk. It's definitely a risk, and it's something that's going to harm the field.
Yeah. And I was having a conversation with, a colleague recently about, the role of NACRJ is limited in all of this. Like, no one is saying, well, I'm not going to say no one. I'm not putting the responsibility on NACRJ to be the standard bearer for this is restorative justice. If you're not practicing it this way, like you're out of this community, XYZ, right? It's not that. But in many ways, like, this is now a professional field. And this work is not necessarily a professional practice. And so like the tension of all of those things is tough. And I don't know that there's like a clear question here, but I don't envy you in your role. Maybe the clear question is, beyond the conferences, which are wonderful gatherings where there's a beautiful exchange of ideas, learning about community, deep learning, and connection between people who are doing this work across the world. What is the work of NACRJ as you see it over the next, I don't know, is 5 years a comfortable framework? Yeah.
I suppose, yeah, the next 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
Sure.
NACRJ started out probably with a small group of people. And of course, Mike Gilbert being the one probably person who helped start it in 2007 or so. And it started out of this desire to bring people together for a conference. And that still is, of course, the largest piece of what NACRJ does. As we have this conversation this week, it coincidentally is National Volunteer Week. And we've been highlighting some of our volunteer groups throughout the week. And I don't know if all people know, but NACRJ up until January of 2022 was a completely volunteer-ran organization. Even Mike Gilbert was not an employee of the organization. And I am amazed at how much NACRJ has been able to do since 2007 by being completely volunteer operated. And when I onboarded in this role a few months ago, I, became the first employee. So we had to go through all of those things that come with now being an employer, so some of the aspects of my job haven't been glamorous or fun the first few months, because it's like setting up employment insurance and unemployment and workers' comp and all of those things. But I think, where we're hoping to head in the years ahead is creating an infrastructure where we have the support internally to then in turn support our members and the wider field. And when you're completely volunteer ran, a lot of our volunteers, they have other full-time jobs. They have other,
all of them have other full-time jobs. Yeah.
And everyone kind of has a mentality of rolling up your sleeves and doing whatever needs to be done in this moment because we all care about this field so much. But, it limits the capacity sometimes, to what can be done. So I am excited to just work on the internal infrastructure and a sustainable kind of funding plan as to how we could potentially onboard more employees, again, with the goal to be able to support our members. The conference has grown so incredibly over the years. There is a graphic that we created after Denver conference. I think it's on our social media pages or on our website. And it shows this graph of attendance in the conference, like from the first years where it's like 200 attendees. And in 2017 in Oakland, I think it increased by like 4 times from what it was in 2015. In Denver, we were at over 1,600 attendees. And I knew this before January, before coming into this role, because I was on the board and I was a volunteer, helping at that time. But what I've really had a front row seat to the past few months is the enormous amount of work that the conference takes in planning. And, I think there are 55 to 60 volunteers in Chicago and Illinois, just on a local level, not even including all the national people across the country who are working on it, all working to put this conference on. But I do think that NACRJ has to balance out a little bit, balance all of the work that we put into the conference with supporting the field in other ways too, that's not the only thing that we do. So we operate a grants program. We've given, I think it's over 40,000 out to entities across the country. And
this podcast included. Thank you very much.
I know I saw your smile, and yes, we were so happy for this to be one of our recipients a few years ago. And so we have that piece. We have, committees. One committee I've gotten to be a part of a little bit is called the Law and Policy Group. I've sat in on it. I'm not an active person, but I've sat in on it as I started my new role to learn about it. But it's talking about things that we were talking about earlier about how do we continue to support good policy and good practice. We have an awesome advisory council that's made up of about 10 people from across the country who do so many things. When I was working at our nonprofit in North Dakota, I remember one of the documents that the advisory council and NACRJ worked on at that time. It was guidelines for restorative practices implementation in K-12 schools. I used that document all of the time with the schools I was working for. So I saw such an asset to NACRJ that they're creating some of these documents. They're putting the time and effort and research into it so that I then, within my own respective world, can benefit from using some of those. And that's one of my aspirations, that we continue to create those documents so that our members and just the wider field, even if it's not a member organization, that they can benefit from those things. The past few years, we have done some really good things with online programming, I guess is what I'll call it. But after, COVID hit, we learned, like I think a lot of restorative practitioners across, the country learned, is that a lot of elements of circle and restorative practices can be achieved via video. I did not always know that. I had never done Circle by video. I had never done restorative conferencing by video until after COVID hit. And NACRJ, after the murder of George Floyd, which was shortly after COVID hit, and then in the past 2 years since, creating online spaces where people can come together and circle is another thing that I really have loved about NACRJ the past few years. So those are a few of the things that kind of come to mind as what we're working on and what we're hoping to, grow and expand in the coming years.
Yeah, policy, membership support, and the thing that you mentioned that like we can't leave out of this conversation is this takes funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of funding comes from members. There's some funding generated through the conference, but there are in order to do this work, right? In order to pay people to do this work, money has to come from somewhere. This might be too much of a tactical question, but if you're willing to go there, how are you looking to continue to maintain momentum in this movement, funds-wise?
Mm-hmm. It is a good question and an important question. And I've been a part of a nonprofit since, like I said, 2005 when I started. Nonprofits in a lot of ways are just like any other business. You need funds to do the services that you do. And so I think one of the things that we are working on, kind of strategic planning wise, is just how do we create a sustainable funding structure? And I'll be honest, as you asked this, I will say the past few months, we've had so much emphasis on the Chicago conference, So even though I've been in my role for, 3 months already, I haven't got to put as much time and effort into kind of that strategic planning element of things, because we just want to support our Chicago conference as much in the moment. But, it might be, NACRJ has never really been had a large focus on grants, where we're the recipient of the grant. And, that could be an opportunity down the road. And I think continuing to just, find funding partners that have mission alignment with what NACRJ does and what restorative justice does. I'm excited to explore those kind of things.
Yeah, beautiful. I don't think I'm going to include that answer. So we do have this conference coming up where people are invited to come from all over the world to meet, to gather, to learn. Vanessa McNorton was here just recently telling people like the beautiful details of everything that's going on. So I don't want you to go into like all of the things, but what are you most excited about for this upcoming conference in Chicago?
Well, I think I'm just excited to be back in person with people.
COVID willing, right?
Yes, exactly. And so that's probably the piece I'm looking most forward to. I mean, like I said, I've been going to the NACRJ conferences since 2013. And I've always just viewed them as, the thing I've always looked forward to is just coming together with other people, So of course I love the keynotes and the breakout sessions, but it's just all of the networking and the reminder of how many people are working on these efforts, I love that piece of it. As we record this, I looked at our registration website this morning, and we are right at 1,000 attendees. And, we anticipate maybe getting someplace between 1,300 to 1,500 attendees. The largest conference, that we've had was Denver, which was just over 1,600. And when we did our original projections after Denver for Chicago, which was originally supposed to be held in 2021, but we postponed it for a year. But original projections for attendance was 1,800 to 2,000 people. And then, of course, when COVID hit, you just had no idea of how things would go. So we lowered our projections to be about 1,200. And so, yeah, we are just at that 1,000-person mark now, but we have, keynotes from, of course, right here in the United States. Edward Valandra, who I know has been a guest, who's geographically close to me in South Dakota, will be there. We have some speakers from New Zealand and Rwanda. So, when you ask what I'm excited for, I'm excited to hear from them. And yeah, just all of the networking was what I'm excited for.
Beautiful. And so, again, signups for that are still ongoing. There is a link in the show notes for you all to engage. We really do hope to see you in early July. We'll be there. Lots of the Amplify RJ community will be there, and it would be wonderful to see you all in person. We've talked about how this work has manifested in your professional life, but how has restorative justice and these ways of being impacted you as an individual?
Yeah, I do view restorative justice as being a part of my being, a part of my life. I have never viewed it primarily as a job, even though I have been employed in the space of restorative justice. I view it as more as of a worldview. David, I view myself as a conflict avoidant person, which is not always helpful, especially in the role of being a facilitator, but it's always easier to be part of other people's conflict or situations opposed to your own. But what I've learned about being a facilitator has helped me in my own life and with my own family. And, on a specific piece, not the restorative conferencing facilitation type process, but with Circle, I used Circle as part of my coming out process with my family. Not when I told them originally, but a year or two afterwards, I brought some of my family together for a Circle. And again, as I often feel about Circle, it really transformed the conversation for me. And yeah, I just, going back to the comment that we mentioned earlier, or the quote about upholding the value of every person, I have no doubt that restorative justice has changed my worldview on the way I look at human beings, and being able to see people for their values opposed to only seeing people for their, what we can see on the outside. So I think it's changed me, and I think it continues to change me.
Yeah. Are there parts of that process that you want to share specifically around what that process was like for your family and how Circle process was helpful?
Yeah, when we did that Circle, we were sitting in my brother's living room. We turned the TV off. We put our cell phones away, but it's not that we were all just sitting in chairs in this, perfect circular formation. Some people were sitting on the couch, some people were sitting on the floor, and we used a talking piece to kind of create that space. And there were things that were shared by some of my siblings and my mom that and maybe I won't, go into detail about what it was, but some of them still stick with me today. And I feel that if we would have used any other process, or if we wouldn't have created a process to have the conversation, some of those things would never have got said. So I'm so grateful for having that experience, because it's some of the things that got said in that setting that still sit with me the most today in a good way. And I think those things would have gone unsaid had we not held the conversation in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. This process is so applicable, not just to our professions, but, in the everyday things, the everyday small interactions and, those big conversations. And so thank you so much for sharing to the extent that you did. Always wanting to keep in mind that consent, confidentiality is all a part of this process. So thank you for being as vulnerable as you were. I want to transition into the questions that everybody answers when they come on. We've already asked you to define restorative justice in your own words. So we're skipping to what's been an oh shit moment as you've been doing this work, and what did you learn from it?
From listening to your other episodes, I thought you might ask me this question, and I thought about it. And David, on the outside, I think what most people will see from me is I'm very mellow and calm. So sometimes I feel like, well, I haven't exactly had that kind of moment. But what I will say on the inside is I usually have anxieties and stress and panic moments, and I overthink a lot. So on the daily, I feel like I have those kind of moments. I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I went through a job loss in January of 2021. The restorative justice program that I worked with in North Dakota since 2005 was housed under a larger nonprofit organization. And last January, I got called into a meeting and was told that that organization is closing immediately. I was so devastated and heartbroken. And, maybe just like anyone that hasn't went through a job loss, you don't think it's going to happen to you. I would never have imagined losing my job the way I did, but I did. And I spent much time after that. I shed my share of tears and being sad, and it took me a few months, but it was this moment in time where I could have probably left this field. I could have just went and worked, someplace else, but that was really not an option to me because I feel so restorative justice is more to me than that. But it was definitely an moment where I had to reflect on much of my life and to think about what I'm going to do going forward. And things worked out. We were able to kind of salvage our restorative justice program and got it situated in other entities in other ways. But going through that was one of the more difficult things one of the most difficult things I've gone through, but definitely the most difficult thing I've gone through on a professional level, and I'm thankful now for the experience of what it taught me. But it was a moment at the time.
Are there like clear lessons that came out of that for you that you can verbalize now?
Yeah. Yes. One of them is I can survive an unexpected job loss. Mm-hmm. I know that sounds like simple, mm-hmm. but I think that is something that I was fearful of beforehand. Like that's something I wouldn't be able to survive and I went through it, as did 280 other people across the state of North Dakota who also lost their jobs at that time as part of this closure that happened. And what I learned is I am more resilient than I think. And, I can move forward in ways that I didn't know that I could. And it just helped me kind of relook at my priorities in life, and actually kind of relating this to restorative justice or circle. I was able to hold on to my values that are important to me. And even though I so identified with my job, I think I identified too closely with my job that when I lost the job, I felt like I lost my identity. And I don't think that was necessarily a healthy thing. So it taught me to view myself not as an employee, it taught me to view myself as a person who has values and can survive with or without a job, and that's part of what I'm taking away from that experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We are more than our work. You're more than your job title and the things that you get paid to do on the daily. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
Well, I'm going to take an easy route for this. I'm going to say my 4 people. I'm going to say my grandparents. So my grandfathers were both passed away before I was born. So I never obviously got to meet them or know them, and didn't really get to have the grandpa experience. One of my grandmas died when I was, I think, about 3 or 5 years old. So I have very limited, if any, memories. And then I had one grandma who was awesome, who died when I was, I think, a senior in high school. And so I think those are the 4 people that I would bring together and talk with. And maybe my question, I think especially for my mom's side, and for my dad too, I think for both, but I would love to know what my parents were like as kids or young adults. My mom is the mother, of 10 kids. My parents are the parents of 10 kids. So I know them as parents, that's their identity now, but I would like to see them or know more of them from their parents' perspective of who they were as kids and young adults.
As someone who only has 2 living grandparents, that's resonant for me as well. Thank you for sharing that. Sometimes we turn that question around to the guest, but we can't do that right now because you only have the experience that you have with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
So I will ask you, what's one thing, a mantra, an affirmation, maybe something else that you want the hundreds, maybe potentially thousands and millions of people in the future listening to this to know?
Well, I'm going to say peace is possible. Peace is possible. The reason I say that is because I believe that if we don't believe that, it's never going to happen. So that I'm going to keep that out there as my guiding star, that peace for each of us as individuals and within our families and within our communities and our wider world, it is possible. So that's one mantra that I try to keep in the forefront of my mind always.
So as we talk about the different ways that people have conceptualized this work, right? Community justice, restorative justice, which are in the acronym NACRJ, there are other words that people use like healing justice, transformative justice. Do those practices belong within this community and in this framework of NACRJ in your mind? Maybe not do they belong, but how do they fit in?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Perfect. No, I like the way you reframed it at the end, because my immediate answer was going to be yes, they do belong. Of course. I have, over my years since 2005 have been most, involved with restorative justice and the community justice piece, which, as you mentioned, is part of the NACRJ name. Usually when someone asks me about transformative justice or healing justice or some of those other pieces, I usually will ask, kind of what that means to them, because I never want to make assumptions, because these topics are so broad and have a broad base. But I think overall, I still view all of these things as being a different way of doing justice, in which was in which the criminal justice system does things. We live in a country that somehow this criminal justice system got built over the course of time. And the way I view, restorative justice or transformative justice, it's this different path of justice that's different than what some of our current structures and systems have in place. And I don't always know the best ways to word it or to define it or describe it, but that's the way that I, for myself, try to make sense of it and try to understand it.
Excellent. Thank you. And this might be the easiest and maybe some ways hardest question, because there are a number of people that I think you could say, but who's one person that I should have on this podcast? With the caveat that you have to help me get them on.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, yes, I'm happy. If there is anybody that I'm connected to that you want, I will be happy to connect. I guess in one way I think of groups of people, and David, I've got through over a dozen of your episodes. So you've probably have had some of these other folks on, but I think about people who have experienced victimization and have went through a restorative process in that capacity, which I'm thinking maybe you have had people on in that way. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I have learned as much about justice and the worldview of Circle from listening to elders. I can think of one elder in particular at Standing Rock tribal reservation here in North Dakota, who, didn't come at this from a academic, or training perspective, but just what justice meant in his community. So I think about, voices like that. And yeah, maybe that's what I'll say for now, even though I didn't mention anybody just specifically, but I would connect you to anyone I could connect you with if you would like.
Beautiful. There are people. I have a list. And we'll have that conversation in just a couple of moments offline. But before we go, how can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Yeah. So yeah, with NACRJ, I've been thankful to be a part of this organization in different ways since 2013. And now I'm involved in the current capacity that I am, but in ways that people can support NACRJ. I mean, our website is nacrj.org.
Mm-hmm.
There's, different ways that people can support us, even ways of volunteering. Like I said, we're an almost all volunteer organization. I have always appreciated being connected to volunteer opportunities. So I would love for people to connect with us in that way. And, coming to the conference, joining one of our online gatherings, are some of the ways that I think people could support us if they are willing to do so.
Beautiful. And those things, of course, NACRJ, the website, and the conference registration will be linked in the show notes. Joel, thank you so much for sharing about NACRJ, sharing about your vision for it, sharing about your story. Very excited to continue to support the work, support the conference. Looking forward to meeting you in person in a couple months. Any other words you want to leave with the people with before we depart?
I don't think so. I thank you for having me on. And as I have learned about restorative justice, it is the thing that has always given me the most hope. It gives me hope. And I know there is no one thing in the world that is perfect, or all encompassing, but I do believe that restorative justice is a piece of the puzzle of the future for us. I deeply believe that. And I'm excited to see where it leads.
Beautiful. Well, Joel, thank you again so much. To everyone else listening, we'll be back next week with another episode of Somebody Living This Restorative Justice Life. Until then, take care.
Thank you so much. One of the really important things that I thought he brought up in this episode was the idea of peace. He mentioned in his mantra and affirmation that peace is kind of the center of a lot of the work he does, and he believes that peace is possible. And I really appreciate also how he brought in the idea of peace begins with me, and internal peace is something that we don't always consider as an important aspect to community peace. How can you cultivate peace within yourself? And how do you spend time, whether that's meditating or doing things you love or taking care of yourself in order to begin peace with yourself? Also, one other thing that I really appreciated about this episode was the focus on the person being harmed. He also mentioned that although it's really important to incorporate both sides or all sides of a story in restorative justice circles and processes, it is also important to center the people who experienced harm in the way that they want to explain it. Explaining how you feel does not have to be perfect, it does not have to be polished, but centering the feelings as they're able to communicate it and taking it at face value is really important. And by doing that for each person who may have been harmed in a scenario, no matter how great or how little that harm might have been. As always, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.